I'd like you, first of all, to look at the slide which is up there, and I'm going to just say something about why I chose this title. There are two reasons. It's Daisy and her English gardens. And in this sentence, English has two meanings. It has the meaning of gardens that she knew in England, and also gardens that she created here and in other places in the English style. In fact, she created gardens in Fürstenstein, several, but she also founded gardens or developed gardens in her other homes in Munich and in La Napoule, which is near Cannes, the south of France. Now the title is Daisy and her English Gardens. This is also has a connection with a very famous book of the period on gardens and gardening by Elizabeth von Arnim, whom I think a lot of people have probably heard of. Von Arnim, Elżbieta? Yes, some people. So I'm going to say something about her later on, because she's an important figure. And as it happens, the garden that she created in Pomerania is now, of course, in Poland. So we have two English ladies who are responsible for gardens in Poland, which is quite interesting. They have recently erected a statue to Elizabeth von Arnim, and people are starting to visit. There's a bit of tourism. In the photograph underneath, you can see in the foreground, wearing a beautiful hat, that is Daisy von Pless. And behind her is her mother, generally referred to as Patsy. Even Daisy never called her mother mother or mummy. She addressed her as Patsy. That was the general name. Cornwallis West. And I've chosen this photograph because Mrs. Cornwallis West, Daisy's mother, was the main inspiration for Daisy's interest in gardening. She was a society woman, famous for her beauty, for her indiscretions with members of the royal family, and a rather scandalous figure. But she had another side. She was a very creative woman, and she poured talent and energy into developing gardens. So the garden where they're sitting now, this is a summer house in a place called Newlands, which is one of Daisy's houses. And Daisy's mother, Patsy, spent every minute that she could, when not working, sitting in the summer house and asking for her tea, coffee, lunch to be brought to her so she could eat it in the summer house. Often when it was very, very cold, and people thought she was crazy. I was interested to read that Daisy herself also had a passion for summer houses, and by her calculation, she spent 7 months a year sitting in her summer house at some point during the day, and her servants complained that she too was mad, because often it was very cold and very unsuitable. So Daisy's mother was a passionate gardener. I will just read something, a quotation from Memoirs of the Period, which says something very flattering about her. Had Patsy lived in more modern times, I am convinced that she could have made a fortune as a landscape gardener. Her eye for colour and her ingenuity in creating loveliness in the most unlikely places amounted to positive genius. Right? Both in Ruthin and in Newland's gardens, everything she touched, she beautified. At each corner you turned, each corner that you turned, the prospect or sight seemed more lovely than the other. So this was great praise for her. Here we have mother and daughter. Between these two women, there was a very close relationship also. But we see it very clearly indeed when it comes to gardening. Right. I'd just like to, at this point, say that this little lecture contains photographs and illustrations from three main sources. And I would like, first of all, to thank Countess Beatrice von Hochberg for allowing me to photograph some very interesting watercolors of the gardens here. So a very big thanks to her. The next person I would like to thank is the director of the Castle Museum in Pszczyna, who has allowed me to use photographs from Daisy's own photograph albums, which contain a lot of garden material. The third source is an excellent magazine for any researchers who are doing research into English gardening, and that is the magazine called Country Life, which started at the end of the 19th century. It contains hundreds of records and photographs of gardens and articles on gardens. And they have allowed me to make use of their archive. And I just need to say, at the request of all three parties, they don't wish any of these images to be reproduced. All right, so right now we're now going to go to the first picture. How is that? Okay, we're going to the first picture, which shows a garden, and behind the garden is part of Ruthin Castle, where Daisy was born in 1873. And this castle looks old. I finished that. It looks old, but most of what you can see was in fact built in 1826, quite late. However, the castle originally was 13th century, but unfortunately in the 17th century, during the Civil War in England, Cromwell's men bombarded the castle for weeks on end, and finally they surrendered. And what happened in the Civil War is any castle that belonged to the other side had to be taken apart stone by stone and completely demolished. Right? So in 1826 a decision was taken to build it, and it was rebuilt, as you can see, in a kind of faux medieval style. It's red. Some people have been there, I know. It's a kind of nice dark red stone. The garden was laid out. The garden that you can see here was laid out in 1949, most of the gardens. And in many ways, it typifies a typical Victorian garden. And if I can just very briefly say that in the 18th century, so 100 years really before this, England was in the grip of landscape gardens. All the grand houses, aristocratic houses, only had grass and trees and streams, no colour. It was completely natural. People started to get a bit fed up of castles in the middle of fields. And at the end of the 18th century, people start to say, this is a bit extreme. Let's plant things closer to the building. So that was one step. And then they started to plant shrubs and two other things. But suddenly the situation changed dramatically in 1820 and 1830, when brightly coloured flowers of new kinds started to be imported, many of them from Latin America, South America. There were trains, so plants could be transported very quickly. There was also an economic boom, and suddenly all these factors came together, and the Victorians started to go crazy for bright, bright colours in parterres or in specially constructed parterres. It's the same word in Polish. And suddenly England went from being green and brown to yellow, blue, red. It was quite dramatic. So these flower beds, these parterres, are probably of the period, the mid-19th century. However, things were changing just a little bit, and okay, that's wait a minute. Is that the same? Oh, that's okay. We're right. Yeah. Actually, this is a rather nice photograph. I find it's nice. I like roses. This is at the side of what you've just seen. That's along one side. And what happened, I'll leave that. What happened is that there was, in about 1860, 1870, a rejection of Disneyland colours, very bright colours, and a kind of reinvention or looking again at the flowers that used to grow in cottage gardens, very simple flowers, and also a search for much simpler and more subtle shades. There was also a great interest in roses, and in many places walls were constructed in gardens, shrubs planted against them, then in front of them either something like this, which is called a double border, or something like this. Okay, I should give a prize to anybody who can name that. So this is in the same garden, this is in Ruthin, and this is a herbaceous border, right? And to have a herbaceous border for anybody British, English, living abroad is a great ambition. I have a little one myself, but it's very small, very modest. And basically what happens, a man, right, is this, right, I'm just sorry, just for a second. A man called William Robinson said that he was tired of all the bright colours, and he suggested that flowers and shrubs should blend in, should match the landscape in an informal and naturalistic manner. He didn't like artificial things in gardens. And he made the suggestion that you should have borders between 3 meters and 5 meters wide, in which you would have byliny in Polish. You would have plants which came up every year. perennials. The idea was always to build those to put those against a wall or perhaps a hedge for shelter and also for contrast. Yeah. So this fashion took off very rapidly, and the queen of this fashion is this lady. She looks a bit like Queen Victoria, but it isn't. This is a lady called Gertrude Jekyll, who is probably the most famous garden designer, certainly of the 19th century, and was very influential, I would say, for the first quarter of the 20th century. She was an extraordinary woman. She trained in art in South Kensington at the best art school in Britain. She was very good at haftovania, embroidery, but unfortunately her eyes started to get worse and worse and worse, and her doctor suggested that she start to take up gardening. So she was an artist, and she approached gardening as an artist. So for her, every garden was a picture, but it was a picture composed of lots of different pictures, and they should all go together. Right? She also was very keen on gradations of color. A very famous garden started with cold colors, white, blue, silver, and then in the middle it became red and yellow, and then it progressed and back to blue and silver. So this is one of her own. This is her own garden, right? Yeah. Now she took this photograph. She was a good photographer, and this is an old technique of developing. You see some very typical flowers. Now the idea with the herbaceous border was to have big things at the back and then progressively smaller things. So you can see this. And also to have a mixture of plants so that you would have flowers in the border for maybe 8 months a year, even possibly 9 months a year. Right? So this is a very good example of her work. I found this in a book, and I thought it was such a beautiful photo, I'd put it in. Here is a most beautiful double herbaceous border. You can see a really long one with a grass path. And I've included it because there is a cedar tree, and Daisy often remembered the cedar trees in her childhood garden. It's a lovely photo. Just to remind you that one of the reasons we have good gardens in England is that it rains a lot. And here, if you can see, there is rain. Here is another herbaceous border, probably in Wales, I think, which is where Daisy was born, and very typical in its composition. All right, so we can see from the black and white photo, before I talked about Gertrude Jekyll, that Daisy's mother was already well into the idea of herbaceous borders, which is not at all Victorian. This is typically Edwardian. Right, yeah? Now this rather pretty house, because I think it is pretty, this is Newlands. This is Daisy's other home, or her parents' other home. This architectural style is called Strawberry Hill Gothic. The dates are 1803, 1806. And it's quite a splendid place. I'm just going to show you something about its situation. In front of this house, surrounded by lots of lawns, there is a very, very big lake. It's in English 3 acres, 1.5 hectares, quite a big lake. All right, and then this watercolor was done by Daisy's father, who was a good artist, not a brilliant artist, but good. And this comes from one of Daisy's own albums she'd put in. Now, you can see here this is taken from the lake, and then you've got some steps going up, and then the main lawn in front of the house is where the cedar tree is, you can see there. Okay, now this is seen from the other side. Now we're looking, and this is quite a spectacular view. If you go there now, there is no view because there are trees in front of it, which is a great pity. The first stretch of water you can see in front of you is the lake. And then right in the distance, you can see a small stretch of water. That is the Solent, which is the water which leads into the English Channel. And behind that is the Isle of Wight. All right, so this was a wonderful view. And this was the favourite house of the Cornwallis Wests for very good reason. It was near London. There was a station not very far away, and the Wests entertained a huge amount, royalty, aristocracy, British aristocracy. So it was a very big, important place. Not a big place, but an important place. And the Isle of Wight, there is a sailing resort called Cowes there. And so the king would just come around in a boat and then leave his boat and then come up to the house. And so there was a lot of going on. Okay, this is the same property, very typical in this period, Edwardian. This is called Water Garden. Okay, and here Mrs. Cornwallis West has constructed herbaceous borders, once again, you can see, and a new kind of paving, which was then fashionable. This picture, unfortunately, it is made not too bad. This is a kind of key picture as far as Daisy is concerned. This is a rose garden, her mother's rose garden in Newlands. And I just have to write it. Daisy, as those of you who know about her, was, I would say, for most of her life, had periods of depression and was very homesick. She was always thinking of home, and when she thinks of home, she is thinking of this garden, Newlands, and specifically this space. And I'm just going to read you just 2 or 3 lines. You have to look up on the left. She wrote this thinking about the terraces here in Fürstenstein. I want to find 2 or 3 places where I can put comfortable seats. And what I really want is a garden like Patsy, her mother, a garden like Patsy has at dear Newlands. All roses and every sort of flower that grows there. And there are iron gates and a red wall, a red brick wall, with red vases, vasone, on the top. It's so lovely. So this comes from Country Life magazine, and I was delighted that actually I found the picture that goes with those words. So I want to say one more thing about Daisy. She was homesick and unhappy very often. She loved this garden. She loved flowers, generally speaking, but I've noticed that the flowers that she loved most are flowers which are heavily scented, which have a very strong smell. And I've kind of decided that she has a kind of, her memory, an olfactory memory. There's always a reference when she starts to reminisce about a strong smell of a flower, normally, right? So this is a kind of key place. And here we are, all right? So here we are. This is you can see, well, the postcard was written in 1900, which is not to say that the postcard was made in 1900, yeah? But I wanted to draw your attention. In fact, I don't need to. It's very similar to the Cordonner or the Schlosshof that we have now. These big mounds of green mounds of yew, which her mother had. We saw in the first picture, very, very similar. Now, I read somewhere that I read an article saying that people have exaggerated the interest that Daisy had in the garden in Fürstenstein, or that she didn't really have very much influence. From the little bit of work I've done from old files from the Wrocław archive, between the head gardener and the director in the Waldenberg Castle, Walbrzeg Castle, I don't think that was true. I think Daisy was in fact quite heavily involved in reorganizing the gardens after she came here in 1892. And so there are, if I just give you, she felt the gardens were too stiff here, basically, right? So I find this is not to do with flowers, but in 1894, there were orders for a completely new fruit garden to be constructed, all quite sophisticated. The usual plants, peaches. Her parents in both of those houses had very big peach houses, for example, here. Apples, berries, gooseberries, grapes, strawberries. Another thing that I noticed, this is in the same year, 1894, there's a big discussion going on about the space in front of the castle. And clearly what Hans and Daisy want is to have masses and masses of roses in front of the castle. And there's quite a bit of discussion. The general direction are very unhappy that they are being asked to find more money for these plans because they were beyond budget. So there was a thing. Anybody who's interested in roses, I have the names of the roses. And the idea was that the roses should be standard roses that stand and then bush out. And then Daisy wanted something, she wanted creepers, greenery between them. And the idea was to fill the parterre in front of the castle with roses. Now, I've never seen any photographs, and perhaps somebody has, to see whether that in fact happened or not. It may never have happened. Yeah? Daisy also had something to say about the space in the main, just at the entrance here, around the Lion Bridge. So that was another thing. In 1895, there's restructuring around the mausoleum. For example, the trees surrounding the mausoleum should be planted in English park style. and the paths round the Eiderberg, I'm just going to talk about that in a minute, need to be completely cleared and grass planted, right? And then other ideas for new roads. Yeah? This particular letter says, the head gardener, he is acting on orders from Hans and Daisy, from both of them, right? So we do that, yeah. Right, so she did, efforts were made, I think, to use her influence. If you look at this picture, when I saw this is about 1902, 1903. When I look at the border, which is on the left, I seem to remember, it looks rather like when we saw the Victorian garden at the side, there were roses which were on islands, a kind of raised beds. And it seems to me, possibly, that idea has been introduced into Fürstenstein. It's only a guess, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Now, yes, I'm going to get on to what Daisy created herself. But when I saw this picture and the following pictures 2 weeks ago in Munich, these were painted in 1923. I was very struck by how colourful they were. I was really surprised. And your photographs this morning, we saw photographs which bear out that this is the kind of real colour. If you look on the right, there is a border with a wall. You can't see the wall behind, but all those plants are absolutely typical English cottage country flowers, typically hollyhocks and everything else. So I think she had something to do with that as well. Another picture. Nice, the trees have been painted. Here we've got daisies. 1923, of course, by then Daisy was divorced from Hans Heinrich. But it may be that just, things had been left. Right, and just hold 1 second. I'm going to go back to that picture. Right, I want to say something now which is a little bit of a mystery to me, and I'll do it as quickly as I can. This is, let me just express that slightly better. I have been intrigued, interested by a garden which Daisy claims or said she had constructed. And I got interested in this garden when I read an article that she wrote in 1902, which is called My Baby's Garden. And it describes the construction of a garden which is very, very like the garden at her mother's home. And she gives, I think I'll just read one little bit from it. This is called My Own Secret Garden at Fürstenstein. At the bottom of my garden and on both sides is a double herbaceous border, right? So we have it, with a grass walk in between, an old sundial in the center. Statues peep out here and there. And then on the outside border, I planted lilac, azalea, laburnum, syringa, japonica, pink and white hawthorns, and other flowering shrubs. And she goes on she gives quite a detailed description. The reason I put this picture, it's typical of herbaceous garden, and I was thinking in a kind of fantasy way, maybe it looked like this. But the other reason is the small flowers, which are in the foreground at the bottom, little pink flowers, these are her favorite flowers. they're actually, in English they're called pinks, but they can be pink or white. And her favorite ones were white. I think this. So you're now looking at Daisy's absolutely favorite flower. She writes them about 6, 7, 8 times in her books. It's called Mrs. Simpkins Pink, but it's white. That's just an English bit of craziness. I'm just going to go back now to this picture. This is a sketch which was done by her father, William Cornwallis West, and I was really interested. It says, it's underneath, sketch for a garden at Fürstenstein. So I was thinking, where on earth could this have been? So I went back to look at the descriptions of this baby's garden, and then I noticed that she intended to extend this garden up the hill and to construct a rose garden. And what she describes in 1902, I suddenly thought, this is it. So I think the intention, as far as I'm concerned, was clear to use her father's design. But of course, it looks very like the garden at Newlands. So it seems to me quite an English construction, not a German construction. Now, this I've been trying to find out for a long time where this garden is, and Pani Stębowska, I think, who is the oldest resident in Fürstenstein, remembers it, just seeing the remains of it with some wild flowers. This is about the time of the war, but it was known as the Princess's Garden, and it's quite near. Once you go through, it's near the castle, but outside the castle. So I had a kind of idea that somebody might even, or if you could find an artist, even to draw or paint from the description, and including this, for example, this little watercolor, maybe even to do a representation or get somebody to do it on a computer. However, the story, yesterday I was talking to Pan Mateusz, and then he suddenly said, "Oh, but I've got photos." I've got photos of this garden. I was astonished because I didn't know anybody had. Forget, we're not going to have time for her. Wait a second. Where is it gone? It's not here. And it's gone. Wait a second.
Excuse me?
No, it's gone. Right?
It will be on the desktop. Just a second.
Okay. Is it there? Yes. Anyway, what I'm going to tell you is this. When I saw this photographed, I was quite disillusioned because it shows something which is... Okay. This came with my breakfast this morning, just before breakfast. Okay, so this is it. And yes, you talk.
No, I will just say this is one of the first pictures taken by Louis Ardouin. To jest jedno z pierwszych zdjęć, które wykonał Louis Ardouin po przyjeździe do Książa w 1909 roku.
Okay, so we have to say thank you to Mr. Ardouin, but it's not as big as I thought it would be. Although this is only part of it, it's not enclosed, which is what I expected. It doesn't have a wall or anything around it. But maybe Daisy writes as if it was completed, but it's possible it never really was completed to do that. Yeah. Right, I think my time is up now, right? So I would just suggest Elizabeth von Arnim is a lady. Just go on the internet, because many people thought that the book she wrote anonymously about starting a garden in Germany was written by Daisy. And there were endless articles, which Daisy keeps. They're in the archive, all the little bits of clippings to say it was not Princess Daisy of Pless, it was not Princess Daisy of Pless. Yeah? So that brings this, I'm going to say, rather impressionistic little presentation to a close. There will, of course, be a full version, a written version, which will be translated into Polish. And I hope my English, listening in English, wasn't too traumatic. Thank you very much.